Welcome to the Smack Happy Design Videocast, where we explore all things web and marketing. With your hosts, Nicole and Danielle.
Welcome to the Smack Happy Videocast, episode number 9. Today we have Brady Helkenn with us. He is an IT and tech support specialist here in San Francisco and the Bay Area. And today we're going to talk to him about how to keep your small business secure online. Brady, can you give us a little intro?
Sure. So I run BH Tech Connection LLC, soon to be incorporated, and I've been in business as for the business in general. It's been about 3 years. I've been in IT for about 10, and I've built up a pretty strong following in the Bay Area for around about 100 to 150 clients at this point. Working on Macs, working on PCs, working on the infrastructure around all of that. And then kind of helping to guide towards more efficient practices and more secure practices, which is kind of along the lines of what we're talking about today.
Very cool. Very cool. I am Danielle Ayera. I work for Smack Happy. I've been with Nicole and the team for 2 years now, I think, almost 2 years. And I do a little bit of everything for the team and Nicole. And I guess for our clients, really. I do some project management, and I've been saying that I specialize in SEO and content. I think that's what I specialize in. So other than that, I am in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. So I am on the East Coast of the United States, which is fun, and that's about it in a nutshell.
All right, thank you. I'm Nicole Hanasek. I'm the owner and founder of Smack Happy Design. I've been coding and designing websites for about 20 years, and I've had Smack Happy for 10 years. And like Danielle said, we do websites and we also do online marketing. So anything that involves your online presence, we can probably help you out with. So speaking of online, Brady, tell us, what is the number one thing that all small businesses should do to be secure online?
All right. Well, obviously, there's a ton of small things that can be done. I would say probably one of the biggest things that somebody can do, especially with online things, has to probably do with passwords and good, strong password management. And whether or not you're doing it as an authentication piece of, I have this email address or username and I have this password, or whether or not you want to extend the topic slightly and talk about multi-factor authentication, which for those who don't know what multi-factor authentication is, that's the practice of having one of those randomly generated 6-digit numbers kind of like texted to your phone, or have it show up automatically on like an app that you open up in order to help you get in after you've put in the email address and password to get into somewhere. And so having a strong setup on both of those two things is probably the biggest thing that you could probably do online as far as protecting your data online. So it's a bigger animal depending on whether we're talking about protection against viruses, or if we're talking about protection against data loss and theft, or against hacking attempts where you now become shut down by somebody because all of a sudden you're spamming email to a bunch of your contacts or something like that. So depending on which side of the coin we're talking about. So the passwords and multi-factor authentication is certainly the one strong thing you do. And I usually recommend people get a what's called a password manager, as kind of a general terminology for it. The tool that I use is LastPass. There's also a few others out there. Off the top of my head, there's 1Password, Dashlane, KeyPass, a number of other options out there. And the idea behind that is it keeps a database that you can fill in of passwords that you can make unique. You can make be randomly generated passwords that you don't even know what they are. You never have to know what they are. The database keeps all of that together. You have one password in order to get into that database. Vast majority of them are encrypted. Some of them are local installs, some of them are cloud-based. And the general practice behind why it's a good idea to have a unique password, to kind of put the question back towards you. Do you use a password manager, for example? That would be a first question. And then the second question is that whether you do or you do not, do you have unique passwords for everything that you use out on the web?
Mhm.
Yeah. We use LastPass, I think, a lot. For our business anyway. And I think we've kind of encouraged a lot of the people that we've worked with to do that as well. So we have clients now, like more sharing with us through LastPass instead of, sending us a username and password through an email or something like that.
Right.
And I know that just from like our clients, I think that a lot of them are concerned with, the hackers. I think it's one of those subjects that's just kind of out there now. A lot of people talk about hacking and as sort of like a blanket term, and are afraid of the anonymouses out there, and the different things like that. So it's, I guess, really at the most basic level, like I would start, if I, just me as a person, an individual looking after my own stuff, I definitely would think, okay, passwords like the first step. So yeah, that's good to know, I think, for sure.
I want to add something really quick, because I think something I've run into a lot in the past, especially with maybe people my generation and older, is, oh, I can't make a complicated password. It's too long. I never remember it. Or they just, they write it down and it's like right next to the computer, which I think is another topic that maybe we could talk about later after we finish this. But, like having a 6-digit password is probably like the worst thing you can do, right? Like it needs to be long and complicated.
Yes.
And so these password managers kind of solve that problem for you, right?
They can, not always. And so there's two different stages, I like to call them, when you're adopting a password manager, coming from not having one. So what you see before somebody gets into a password manager at all, so you guys are ahead of the curve compared to, say, there's a good chunk of my clients that I'm still trying to convince of the value of it and stuff like that, right? And there's definitely, I get up on a soapbox and I espouse the virtues of a password manager every chance anybody gives me. I even just wrote a blog post about it, and it broadcast out through my newsletter, I think a week or two ago. And when you don't have a password manager, the human brain's only able to think of so many variants that you'll always be able to remember. And it almost always comes down to one or two core structures that you create the variations on. And so, I knew somebody whose password literally just used the word password and then like did variants of it, whether or not he put a number somewhere, whether or not he took out an S, whether or not he started it with an exclamation. And he just would do something to the whole thing, but he would start with password, because he would remember that his password was password, and then he could go ahead and figure out everything else after that. And so even then, you only have so many combinations that you can readily think of, especially when you're pairing them against specific websites, and you have to be the database. Your brain has to be the database without a password manager. And we're much less efficient at it than an actual product that's been created specifically for that purpose. And so what ends up happening is that there's a lot of shared passwords at that point. You have 5 or 6 variants, but a lot of people don't realize this. A personal user, I don't know the exact statistic, but at least in my experience over the past 10 years, the average user probably has at least 50 passwords out there online, even if they don't think they do. And it's surprising, because if you ask somebody to list them all, they could come up with 5, 10 maybe. If they're particularly aware of what they're doing online, they could come up with maybe 15 or 20 after that, if they thought hard enough. But there's a lot of things that you only go and check once a week, once a month, once a quarter, sometimes once a year, not even that half the time, every once in a while. And when you have passwords like that, then oftentimes what do people do when they forget? They forgot password. Send it back to your email, get in, and you do it. And that kind of illustrates one of the key problems with having shared passwords, is particularly if your email password is a shared password. because what ends up happening is that somebody guesses what your Amazon password is, and then they come back and then just go, okay, let me just try logging into you then, because your Amazon email account ends with gmail.com. I know where to go. I'll try that email address at Google and try that password. And if it's a shared password, lo and behold, now I have access to your email. Now I get to run some script somehow to try auto logging into Amazon, eBay, Chase, Citi, Bank of America, whatever, right? You just do some script and hit everything, not necessarily everything created equal. You get into social media, you get into bank accounts, you get into retirement accounts, you get whatever you want based on even just running the basic scripts there. But as soon as somebody gets access to email, they can run their own script there to just do forgot password links for all of those things. And if there is an email account out there for it and somebody's email gets compromised, that's the keys to the kingdom for a lot of the accounts. Yeah. And so it becomes really important to have a unique password for the email. But as soon as you start to introduce something like that, we all know conceptually that it's a good idea then to do that for all of our social media and to do that all for each of our banks. And the next thing you know, now we're back to the same problem where we have 10, 20, 30, 40 unique passwords and you can't think of them all. And you write it down in a little piece of paper, stick it next to your computer, as you were saying. And there were times when somebody would literally just, I still see it when I go to clients that I haven't talked out of it yet, or even if it's just the first time that I'm seeing them and they don't do it again after I tell them about it. But they'll put the login for the computer and they'll Post-it note it right on the computer. It'll be a laptop and they'll literally just have it right next to the keypad.
I can remember that happening so often whenever I worked in corporate.
Yeah. And it's particularly prevalent in corporate environments where the password changes, right? It's considered a good security practice to make everybody change their password every 3 months or every 6 months. And you have something like that set up, and then you get those people that get irritated because they don't remember what version of the password they're now on, and so they'll just write that thing down and keep it next to the computer. And at that point, you've completely wasted the point, and you might as well have just took off the password requirement for their computer at that point because there's no functional difference anymore. So
quick question.
Yeah, go ahead.
So one methodology I've heard for creating a password is to have like one long base password that's maybe complicated. And so that base password is the same, but if you're logging into like Facebook, it would be -Facebook, or if you're logging into Twitter, -Twitter. So you have like this long base and then the location of where the password is. So that makes it nice and long. And then it's also like technically different for all of the different types of accounts. What do you think about doing it that way?
I think it's a logical fallacy. We like to think that making things unique, even in a significant way such as that, is going to be good enough. One thing that a lot of people don't necessarily think of is that if you found advice online for how to create a strong password and how to have variants, so too has the hacker. And it takes about 10, 20 minutes for them to code something into their script the next time they come across an article. And to code a couple of lines into a script to check for those kinds of variants, it takes an extra millisecond or two for some brute force attempt login for them to try 50,000 different variants that some people have talked about online by now. All of that maybe takes them an extra 5 seconds in the script itself. And so a lot of people think, well, if I just have this one core and then I have some variant of the core, immediately I shut it down. It's a logical fallacy, because especially how are you supposed to differentiate between your email core password and your bank web core password if you're going to be wanting both of them to be very strong? Is there one that's just going to be a root, or are you going to be tacking on -Gmail or -email or whatever? And again, you've got 5 different combinations, 10 different combinations that somebody's going to put into the script anyway, that they're going to know. If you're on Gmail, it's going to check for all that stuff, whatever. And the only way that you could theoretically get around it is if you just came up with some 6-digit gobbledygook after the dash that has no bearing whatsoever on it. But once you start doing that, you don't remember what that is anyway. Right? And so that's what
kind of like goes back on the point of doing that, I guess.
Yeah. And so yeah, go ahead.
This just makes me think of and I saw this a while ago. It might be like 1 or 2 years old, but still pretty relevant and funny. Jimmy Kimmel does this like street kind of question skit, and there was one that he did, and I'll post it when we post this podcast on the website. I'll share the link to the YouTube. Hopefully, I can find it. There's somebody on the street just going up to whomever and asking them just a series of a few questions, and then they guess their password for whatever they were using. So they only had to ask a few simple lines of questioning. And so it's funny because, what we're all talking about is so important of how you actually can create like unique passwords, and not like people are thinking, oh yeah, this is unique. Nobody knows this, my dog's name, or nobody knows like my aunt's middle name, but it's like so easy to kind of like, make those decisions and not know that you're doing the wrong thing. And I mean, it was funny the way it all went down. So I'll have to share that link. But basically, this person asked a few questions to some different people on the street, and were able to like guess their password just by asking them a few things in a regular conversation. So.
Well, it's interesting. I've got some fun anecdotes that I can always share all day long, but there's certainly something that one of the things that I had come across as a recommendation for those of us with password managers, and again, obviously, I'm going to stand on my soapbox and espouse that for every last person listening, because you can get them free if you're by yourself, and you pay a little bit to have them on a team, right? But one tactic that I did see that I really do appreciate, and I myself am trying to adopt it more, freely admitting that I haven't yet fully, is the idea that when you have those security questions, right? When you're first logging in to a specific website and you don't remember, and it doesn't recognize your computer, right? And it has to ask you, where were you born, or where did you meet your partner? What was your favorite, teacher growing up, right? Whatever. It's such common sense to us to just go ahead and put in the truth, and it never once occurs to us as human beings to lie. At least most of the time. I've met one or two people who instinctively go, well, they don't need to know that. But even then, even the people that have lied that I know of in the past that would just deliberately put the wrong thing in there would still be answering it as if it's the answer to a question. One of the suggestions that I did see that I actually really truly appreciated was the idea of doing an auto-generated password that could just be 6 digits long, 8 digits long, right? Just some gobbledygook, some garbage, and you just put that in as your answer when you're first creating the account, or when you want to go in and adjust the security answers. Because if you have the password manager, it's just a simple matter of going into the notes field of any particular website that you have saved. And if my Amazon wants to ask me 5 different security questions, and I have 5 different things where I just type out the question and then afterwards paste this little 6-digit auto-created thing as the answer, then it asks me, and I go and open it up and I copy and paste into the thing, and nobody ever has to know what the heck anything was. And one interesting suggestion. Sorry, go ahead.
That's a great suggestion.
Yeah, one of the interesting fringe benefits of this comes back to the Equifax breach. Equifax has so much of our information at this point. We're constantly now living in it feels in some ways that we're living in a post-dystopian, a dystopian kind of future where all of a sudden all of our identities are just on the open market because it's all been compromised. They like to say whatever the number was, what was it, 145 million or something like that identities stolen. And how, I remember looking this up, how many people lived in the United States. Like the actual number of people in the United States was something in the 300s, I believe. And when I'm looking at that, I'm thinking, it's not such a far cry to look at that. And if you take out the children and you take out the small segment of the population that are like maybe seniors or generations, or even just people who just would not get online ever and just stayed offline the whole time, anybody that never had to do credit, and there are people, sometimes you have undocumented people who are just never or not even on the radar at all, but they might be included in the number of people that live in the United States. Once you take all of that kind of facet out, and my instinct tells me that pretty close to 100% of people who actually have their identity online with Equifax available to be stolen, in fact, all got compromised in one go. So the news like to represent it as like, 1 in 4 Americans or 1 in 3 Americans got compromised. And I'm looking at it and I'm going, I'm not entirely sure I felt like it was a misleading statistic to look at.
Yeah, because not everyone's online. Yeah.
Yeah. And when you look at the reality of really who would be online in our country, that number is no longer 1 in 3, 1 in 4. It's pretty close to 100%.
Yeah.
Or at least it's well past 50%, I would wager. And
did you
when we think about those things, it's what do we do to protect ourselves? There's the classic advice that people had been giving out about doing credit freezes and stuff like that. I myself had recommended that back when the breach was still the main topic in the news. But it also brings up, side questions. How are you supposed to protect your online presence when every question you answer into a security field is something somebody else already has, even if they recognize that they can do something with your identity in your account? And that's where you start to get into that second layer. So, beginning of the topic, sorry to be rambling so much, but when you're asking about what would be the one thing, and I mentioned it was both passwords, but then I also mentioned two-factor authentication, that plays a very crucial piece to this, because even in scenarios where you have a good, strong, unique password, all it takes is a data breach of that particular provider and your password's been exposed. Now, tools like LastPass, and I've probably a couple others at any rate, but I can only personally vouch for LastPass as a user of LastPass itself. If you run a security tool, you can find out in a list what LastPass recognizes as being compromised, because they know when you put that password into their database. So they know that if you put the password into the database and it's been 9 months and a data breach happened 5 months ago at that website, they will now tell you in the security score that this has probably been compromised. You should change it. And that's a really helpful thing to be able to run every once in a while. Maybe once a month, once every other month, you do a security check on all the passwords in your system and find that kind of information out.
So that's not something that happens automatically within the password manager. You have to proactively.
As far as the security check, correct.
Yeah.
Security check is something that you do a drop down and you choose it. And there's also a slight variant for those of us on team-based LastPass. The security check only checks our LastPass database. So any shared folders that are configured, you check in the admin console. We don't have to get too far into the technicalities of that, but
gotcha. So what other kinds of measures can a business take to prevent some kind of catastrophe? Like something you see that maybe happens often to businesses and you're like, oh, if only they had done this, wouldn't have this problem.
Yes. And I think human-based procedures and systems for people that are not siloed, alone, solo. For example, Smack Happy, you got a bunch of people on a team working with you. So one of the things to use you guys as a direct example of somebody who I would be talking to would be if you wanted to protect against hacked emails. One, you have the strong password. It's a unique password. You have it logged in LastPass. You don't have to remember what it is, and you have multi-factor authentication turned on, so that even in the event that password gets exposed to somebody that shouldn't have it, it still doesn't help without that device or that app that they're also needing to use in order to put that randomly generated 6-digit number in. So that's that kind of you always want to protect your password from being leaked and exposed anyway, but it provides that extra layer of defense, a little bit of wiggle room to give you the time to realize that it's been exposed or possibly compromised, that you should change it. And there's advice out there that I don't necessarily think is terribly helpful along the lines of how often you change a password. It has traditionally been highly recommended to change it on a frequency, on a specific frequency schedule, what have you. But without the systems put in place, either through LastPass or through some other mechanism that's agreed upon, without some system to handle the change in security posture, the decisions that you guys make, then it actually ends up doing more harm than good. You end up with the Post-it note on the computer. for example. And so the multi-factor authentication to be turned on, it's only as helpful as how well that's being implemented. And so there is a tendency for us to want to use an app because we can have a whole bunch of them come together in one app. One thing that a lot of people don't recognize is that if the phone isn't properly backed up, so that if you lost it, if you dropped it in the toilet, you got a new phone, you could restore everything exactly the way it was. If you had to install from scratch, all of those 6-digit number generating things are lost, in the sense that that app was configured at the time that you configured it with the account. It is only on that device. So you install it on a second device, you have to go through the same setup in order to figure it all out. And so when I talk to somebody who I could tell right away wouldn't necessarily be able to keep up with that in their head as kind of a keep this in the back of your mind kind of thing, I tend to end up recommending that they go the text-based option as often as possible, because you might drop your phone in the toilet, but when you get the new phone, you'll still have your phone number ported over to it. And so don't break that system.
So are you saying that the password stuff is probably like a good measure to avoid some of the catastrophes that you see?
So the catastrophes that I see have to usually do with, along at least this particular thread we've been following today, around online presence, security, all that kind of stuff like that of our access. It almost always comes down to an email hack. And I had been mentioning there's a social engineering aspect to this. I don't know if you're familiar with the term social engineering. It's the concept that a hacker who has your information from Equifax calls up, AT&T, your Comcast or whomever, and goes, "Hi, this is Nicole. I'd like to shut off my internet, please." And give the right information, and then the person goes, "Green light, okay, are you sure you want to close it?" "Yes, I'm sure." "Okay, we've closed your account." Next thing you know, you have no internet. And the way I see this happening in email form tends to be through the wire transfer kind of scheme, where owner's account gets hacked. Now owner sends accountant an email, "Please wire this money to this account." And because the owner, it's coming from the owner. So the bookkeeper, if they're not suspicious, if it isn't raising a sufficiently large red flag for them, will go, "Are you sure?" And they'll go, "Yes, I'm sure. Do it. I need this done ASAP." And they go, "Oh, okay. Well, I wired $4,000 to this foreign account now." And by the time somebody figures it out and they come back in, they've lost $4,000. They have to take it up with their bank. There's high question whether or not they'll ever get the money back. And that's the kind of scenario that I have seen happen, where it's a combination of the passwords that are being used, the multi-factor authentication, whether or not they're having it be a unique password, whether or not they are training their staff and their vendors to know what would be typical, what wouldn't be typical. One suggestion that I could always make for somebody as far as the social engineering aspect is to contact your vendors and train the team in such a way that if something requires some transfer of money, or there's some trigger to target, whether it's a money transfer, whether or not it's sharing of some password or some access to somebody, to have some formalized checklist that either has to be done in person or that only the internal persons would know, that kind of thing.
So do you mean like if my company provides a service that like we should have a checklist? So if someone, let's say I have a client, it's like a bookkeeper or something, and someone calls and says that they're her, and they're trying to like do something with her account, like me as the business, I should have this checklist, right?
Yes, although usually it works the other way. Usually it would be more of a informing your bookkeeper that you now want them to implement some basic check with you. So
Okay.
Call her to say, "I want to wire this much money to this account."
Gotcha. Would you be able to send us like your suggestion for that list so we can include it in the show notes?
Sure, yeah.
Yeah.
I'll draft something up, yeah, definitely.
That'd be awesome.
This was something I was thinking of. Yeah. There was something I was thinking of while we were talking about all of this collectively. There's somebody that I know, and this might help some other business owners, I guess, just almost like a warning, but then also, I mean, it does have to do with security and websites. So it kind of like all comes together in one little ball. So there's a small business owner that I know that had, he has a totally online business, e-commerce business, and typically it's a really low risk sort of transaction, and there's not a lot of stuff to complete on their end. So it's really like a black and white sort of situation most of the time. And, they have the good relationships with the credit card companies, with the security and everything. But so it was something that I found really interesting was out of the merchant's control when something like this happens. Someone's identity who was a customer of theirs was stolen. They used that person's name, their credit card, and it was like somebody who had purchased several times before. So in using this purchase, they, were able to look at the past purchases and say, you know what, this person typically spends this much, per transaction or whatever. And this is all looking at their information, not the business's information. So, they take this person's information, they buy, this mass amount of product, they get it sent to UPS, and I'm going to call UPS out on this. They are supposed to also have rules in place, which they don't. Anyway, towards the end of this whole thought process here, the business owner is actually responsible for the credit card charges because this person's identity was stolen. It wasn't their fault. So they have kind of like a consumer protection sort of in place on their end with the credit card. But the business, even though in this case, they did not know that the credit card was stolen. They, there was no reports. Sometimes it happens. And I think with like larger businesses, they have sort of like contingency plans for that, but smaller businesses kind of don't. And which is hurts them because, I mean, if this was like a $12,000 oops, you know what I mean? So this is what they had to pay. And so then, and I mentioned UPS, what they did, and I can't remember what the name of them are called. There's like a term for the type of stealing that they were doing. So they would have somebody come to the UPS place, and they're supposed to have some things in place where they verify your identity and picking up a package, where I guess most of the time they don't. And this person was able to actually take the stuff that they ordered and, merchandise mules. That's what somebody told me.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah. So it's just one of those things. It's like, as an individual and as a person who works for a business, who has respect for, business ownership and business transactions and things like that, I think of myself, I'm like, not only am I protecting myself and my identity, but I'm protecting the businesses that I shop at, uplifting my community and things like that. It all comes full circle because if your stuff gets compromised, then the business you're working with may not even know they're getting compromised too. It's one of those things. It's like why I think it's super important to be as secure as you can be. And even though it might seem monotonous or whatever with all the passwords and things like that, it's almost like a necessity now. I mean, I don't know, just sharing that thought and kind of giving a tip to small business owners that that can happen. It's something that can happen.
And, I've spent the first 3/4 of my life only looking at it through the consumer lens, right? And only in the last quarter of it have I really started to look at what impacts show up on the business side. And this strays a little bit away from IT consulting specifically and gets a little bit more into broader liability concerns, right? But right out the gate, there would be a few things that I would be wanting to ask this e-commerce business owner.
Sure.
And it would either be along the lines of, is there some purpose to running the e-commerce system yourself versus having a popular third-party platform with more name recognition anyway, such as like PayPal or what have you, that where they take a percentage, but they offer the seller themselves a little bit more protection. There's also other questions around the idea of maybe having some kind of inability or or maybe not inability, but perhaps some rules set in place for you can only purchase so much of an amount, either in quantity or in dollar amount or in the total transaction, whatever you wanted to look at, before it fails the transaction, or it says to the consumer side, great, everything's fine, but now there's some internal flag where somebody gets an alert that they now have to call the person to find out. You have some independent verification before the actual processing of the transaction really truly happens. And then there's even another question along the lines of, I'm not an insurance agent, but the thought occurs to me that I think there is some business insurance that may cover that kind of scenario as well.
Yeah.
Where that if there is a scenario where they have sold some large amount to merchandise mules effectively, and now that money has been lost, the consumer needs to get their money back, and now you're in the hole, but you need to make a claim. That does imply that there's probably some level of insurance that could be set up in
Yeah.
conjunction with e-commerce.
Yeah, that's interesting. I never even thought about insurance, the insurance route, and if that.
Right, and the thought occurs to me that it might exist. I'm not an insurance agent.
Yeah,
so
sure, yeah.
So you contact your local insurance agent, folks.
Yeah.
But along those lines, it's there's usually always something that can be improved in the systems to prevent social engineering, to prevent that kind of theft, and this all kind of ties together with the idea, this theme of feeling like we're in this post dystopian future where now our entire online persona is just up for sale. And how do you protect yourself against that with just little puny old password manager, right? It's hard to say what one thing, to get down to that initial question at the beginning of the video cast. What is that one thing that you can do online? And unfortunately, the short answer really kind of turned into the official short answer is really there is no one thing that you can do that really truly protects you. The best mileage you get for somebody who's dipping their toes into this, that don't know where to start, that's where you should start, is in the passwords, is in setting up the multi-factor authentication, getting that piece of your online presence under control, right? There's those questions that we're diving into along the lines of social engineering, but there's also other questions around, what am I thinking of here? How do you protect against even virus infections? And I'll save that. There's a story that I'll tell towards the end of this. I'll save it for the end. But
I think you can probably go ahead with the story. We'll be wrapping up soon. So
okay, yes.
Our question to Brady was going to be, what is your craziest client experience? And I assume that's what you're referring to.
It is, in fact, yes. And so there's plenty that I could always choose from. IT consulting, especially for the past even 3 or 4 years in small business, 1 to 10 people kind of thing. You see any number of things. I've listened to your previous episodes of podcast of your video cast, and I know you guys have seen some pretty interesting things on the web design front too. We all have those kinds of stories, but I would say probably the most topical and recent example would be the idea of having a small office that has to observe HIPAA compliance. And HIPAA compliance, for those who aren't aware, is the idea of you have patients' medical record information of some form. And so depending on what specific field you're in kind of doesn't matter. You end up getting a lot of the same information one way or the other to help the patient. And there was a ransomware attack that happened against this client. And here I come trying to fix it and find out that their server was being used as a workstation, which is a violation. They had email loaded on the server, which is the source of the ransomware infection, was through an email attachment, also a violation. And then here was the part that kind of comes down almost to the social engineering aspect, but it touches on some password issue as well. It's the idea that they didn't have a password manager, but what they used, which a lot of people associate to be the same thing, and it's not, and here's why, is they had their Google Chrome web browser save passwords for them. And the reason why this is not a password manager is because there is no real control over when you want them to display those passwords for you and when you don't want them to save those passwords, and whether or not they want you to retype a master password. Anyway, the reason for this is because they used a cloud backup tool that ordinarily I would be using to download all their stuff to get their stuff back. Because in a ransomware infection, side note, you can't get your stuff unencrypted. It's a one-way street. You pay the ransom to decrypt it, or you find your backups, right? And so I'm going to do the backup only to find out that the password is autofilled. And when I go in there, the hacker managed to get remote access into the server far enough to go into their cloud backups and delete everything. So not only was their local stuff encrypted, but their cloud backups were also deleted. And the resolution to the story is fairly positive considering the awfulness that had been in the middle. They got their data mostly back in pieces from the crash, from the cloud backup. They had managed to call in and go, I accidentally deleted all my stuff. You don't need to know the details or whatever, right? And they go, oh, well, sure, that's fine. Here's all your stuff that you just deleted. So they got their stuff back, and like a week later, they're managing to piece all of their stuff together, and they're functioning again. They've got their data back. And, I left them with a laundry list of things that they needed to do to get compliant with HIPAA and all that kind of stuff like that, right? But one of the things that this also highlights is one of the things that made this so crazy was that the ransomware usually is just a script. This was combined with somebody doing a remote access into that computer as well. Because that cloud backup, I don't know if you know what I'm talking about, those little checkboxes as part of like the CAPTCHA. You don't have to type in like what you see there. You just click a checkbox. But it's an action that you as a human are the only thing that can do that. No script can do that, as a reason why it exists. And so that was my proof positive that somebody had to be at the helm to click the checkbox to get into the cloud backup to delete it all. And so this is what made it kind of a, wow, this is a crazy story. And what makes it relevant to the topic here is that they should, quite apart from all the violations they were having, they really should not have been putting their passwords into the Google Chrome browser. It is a convenience, but it is not necessarily secure. And people think that it is a little bit because it asks you to type in your computer password if you want to actually expose what that password is. But that's not quite the same thing, right? It still lets you autofill without any verification. And there's not really any way to tweak that. And this made it way too easy for somebody remotely at the helm to just let it autofill, click the checkbox, you're in magically, and now you get to delete everything. They made it so easy, red carpet, right? And so there's a social engineering aspect in here having to do with they're pretending to be the person who owns the backup account so they can delete all the backups. There's a social engineering aspect to the fact that the infection came from an invoice.zip file that was sent to them in email, and somebody was not trained sufficiently to understand that that was most likely a virus that they should really not click on. And there's any number of takeaways from this that have to do with protecting ourselves online, protecting ourselves from a security standpoint, having the good passwords, but having the good password systems like a password database that isn't just part of a convenient thing from your web browser. But to actually have it be, say, LastPass is my general recommendation, but you can have Dashlane or one of the others to kind of get to the same place. And so,
yeah, I think for anyone listening who doesn't know this yet, like when you get an attachment in an email, don't just automatically open it.
yes,
Be suspicious and be skeptical if you don't already know this.
And a vast majority of the time, they also give you some really obvious clues to their intent in the form of not always, but a vast majority of the time they come in as plain text. We're so used to seeing HTML, it's almost a visual trigger for us. Like, really, you should look twice. Why is the font so weird? Oh, it's because it's plain text and there's a zip file that they want me to click on, trying to tell me that I have an invoice for somebody I've never heard of. And so it starts to beg the question of, like, how far are you really thinking when you're opening up a file and then you're going opening up an email and then just double clicking on an attachment? There's a point at which maybe you're just tired. Sometimes there's been a few times where I've gotten a call from a client and they're almost crying because they are embarrassed that they just clicked on this thing, and the instant they clicked on it, they went, oh crap, and then that's it. That was it. They were just didn't have enough coffee at 4 p.m. and just clicked on the wrong thing without quite thinking about it. And they're smart. They're smart. We're all smart in our own way, even if it's not in tech, right? It's even if it's not in security, even if it's not in web design, even if it's not in password things, right? I have clients who are very intelligent people who still talk to me about that cloud that I don't like to deal with, and I have a very firm belief that everybody is a genius in a very specific area, and it's just my good fortune that I happen to be in IT, and that's where my talents lie. But their talents lie in a way that I would be completely flabbergasted to try and do what they're doing, and as long as that's kind of kept in mind, it's really easy to forgive somebody that calls you almost crying at 4 p.m. going, I'm so sorry, I need your help. And I've lost everything. Help me. And it's because I clicked on this file right as I realized that I shouldn't have been clicking on this file. And it's the same idea behind like going to try and download some software you're looking for. If you can't find it in the first web page of Google, you probably won't. And it's usually a good idea to just stop right there and try and find a different software. And that's a failure that I've seen plenty of people, and I myself, and thankfully it's been a few years since the last time I've done this, have fallen prey to, is that when you really desperately want some particular software, you will do just about anything, and you will lower your standards without even consciously realizing it. And this is the part that really catches people off guard, is that idea that your standards are lowering, even if you're not realizing it consciously as you're looking for something. You start to go, well, maybe this has it. Maybe this happened. And then you'll start to notice that there's websites you've never heard of before. And you go, well, who knows? Maybe it's an upcoming company and they just have this website for, they have this thing for me. And you make a bargain with yourself and you open it up, and next thing you know, your computer has blue screened, or you've got a redirect thing, or you've got some pop-up now scanning on your computer, and you're like, oh dear God. And it becomes a really easy thing for us to fall into. And so, knowing how you're searching online, knowing how to protect your access to your stuff online and your identity, your accounts, these are the kinds of things that we need to do in this dystopian future.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Brady. I think we have a lot of juicy notes to share for the download for this episode. I think we'll also include a link to your blog post about the password managers, because I think that'll be really useful for people as well. So thank you again for joining us. You want to tell people how to find you online in case they get hacked or want to prevent getting hacked?
Yes. Finding me by my name is fairly easy via LinkedIn and Facebook. Also, I have a website, bhtechconnection.com, which I'm happy to say is hosted by you guys. Little reverse plug there. I'm fairly easy to find, either through my name or through my company name. And then I've got, a contact page there, and I've got plenty of other mechanisms to get a hold of me that way.
All right, thank you. And if you want to get today's show notes, you can go to smackhappy.com/videocast. Thank you for joining the Smack Happy Videocast, where we explore all things web and marketing and help support small businesses.
Yeah, and until next time, we will see you later. Bye.
Thank you for listening to the Smack Happy Design Videocast. For more information and downloads, visit smackhappy.com/videocast, where you'll find more episodes and the opportunity to subscribe on YouTube or iTunes. You can also sign up for our newsletter delivered to your inbox monthly. And if you enjoyed this episode, please share it with your friends and colleagues. Again, that's smackhappy.com/videocast. See you next time.